Hearing will come to order. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our third subcommittee hearing of the season. Today we'll examine the proposed fiscal year 2021 budget for the Federal Aviation Administration. We're pleased for the first time ever before this subcommittee to have Administrator Steve Dixon on hand to testify and answer our questions. We appreciate your being here. The FAA provides critical services on behalf of the traveling public every day. Millions of flights, both scheduled and unscheduled, must safely navigate our national airspace, the most complex in the world. This year's FAA budget requests $17.5 billion in budgetary resources, a decrease of about $96 million compared to last year's enacted level. Overall, the request is essentially flat. It eliminates $400 million for supplemental airport grants and then increases funding for the operations account by $372 million, mostly to cover salary and retirement benefits. Funding for the facilities and equipment account and the research, engineering, and development account see modest reductions. FAA identifies about $1 billion in proposed next-gen investments in their budgetary request that would allow the agency to continue efforts to modernize the air traffic control system, improve efficiency, and transition legacy equipment to new platforms. Emerging technologies, including unmanned aerial systems and a burgeoning commercial space industry, hold great promise to revolutionize the national airspace and boost our economy, but they do pose challenges to the existing regulatory framework. A total of about $144.5 million is requested for UAS programs and another $44 million for commercial space activities. Yesterday was the one-year anniversary of the Boeing MAX tragedy in Ethiopia, which killed 157 people. This Friday will mark the one-year anniversary of the FAA order that grounded the MAX indefinitely. These two anniversaries do remind us that safety must be the FAA's highest priority. The public and the Congress expect complete transparency as the FAA works to safely return the MAX to service and evaluate outside recommendations to reform their oversight procedures and the certification process. Numerous committees and expert review bodies have identified various areas of potential improvement for FAA's regulatory procedures. Some recommendations, such as bolstering human factors and system safety expertise, are about acquiring new skills and incorporating this knowledge into the certification and flight standards process. Others are specific to Organization Designation Authority, or ODA, which has come under scrutiny in the wake of the Boeing disasters. Initial reports suggest that private sector employees who possess this delegated authority may face undue pressures from management to prioritize production timelines over the safety of the traveling public. That is never acceptable. FAA oversight of ODA must extend not only to ensuring a workable division of labor between the agency and private firms, but also, above all, to ensure there's no slippage with regard to relentless attention to safety and the maintenance of a safety-first culture. I'd like to underscore that the recently enacted fiscal 2020 omnibus package directed FAA to respond to each recommendation and report to the Appropriations Committee about any resource or funding needs. The agreement also included targeted investments to jumpstart this process, including $6.8 million for salaries and expenses of additional staff with expertise in human factors, system safety engineering, software, data analytics, and other valuable skills, $6.2 million to cover the costs of technical training and credentialing for flight operations, aircraft certification, and other specialties that support aviation safety, $3 million for FAA to provide guidance and training to international civil aviation authorities, foreign air carriers, and other stakeholders to better understand U.S. safety standards and how to integrate U.S. manufactured aircraft into their own regulatory frameworks. I'm glad to see the FAA's budget request proposes $70 million above the enacted level for the Office of Aviation Safety and other staff offices to improve FAA's safety oversight. Look forward to learning more about the activities described in the request and how they complement these investments, ongoing investments that I just described. Of course, we know that funding isn't everything. Resources must supplement the right policies, the right people with the right skills, and again, a culture that prioritizes safety above all else. We're closely following the work of Chairman DeFazio and our authorizing partners on the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Last week, they released preliminary recommendations from their Boeing investigation. We look forward to reviewing legislative proposals that emerge from their extensive inquiry and working with them to ensure that FAA has appropriate funding to make any necessary changes. Finally, I hope we can spend some time today explaining, understanding the FAA's role with respect to the public health threat posed by the coronavirus. Are you working with CDC, for example, to get guidance to airports, airlines, and the traveling public? What role is the FAA playing in the administration's task force? What should the American people know about their health risks if they choose to fly right now? Administrator Dixon, the FAA and its dedicated employees have an exceptionally challenging mission, one that's vital to our safety, economic well-being, and international competitiveness. Look forward to your testimony today and working with you to ensure that FAA has the resources required to carry out its considerable responsibilities. And now I'd like to recognize my partner and friend, Representative Mario Diaz-Balart, the ranking member of this subcommittee, for any remarks he might have.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for recognizing me and for, more importantly, for holding this important meeting. And Administrator Dixon, welcome to your first appearance before this subcommittee. I was struck, Administrator, by, frankly, your unique qualifications for this job. I don't know if there's anybody that we've had who's been more qualified for the job that you are now holding. So 10 years you served as an Air Force fighter pilot, then spent another 3 decades working for major airlines as a commercial pilot in, I notice, a number of different aircraft, and also as an executive. I know this background is serving you well as you lead the FAA at a particular challenging time, as the chairman just mentioned. It's been a year since the Boeing 737 MAX was grounded, following the tragedies in Ethiopia and Indonesia, and I know you're hard at work dealing with those issues. I look forward to hearing about the status of that review and how you plan to take the lessons learned from this review to improve the certification and other processes, safety programs at the FAA. FAA is and must continue to be a world leader in aviation safety, and I'm proud of the work that Chairman Price and I have, and the subcommittee, have done over the years to support your agency to make sure that you maintain that global leadership role. We have done so through supporting air traffic controller and safety inspector workforces, along with investments in next-gen technologies. I am pleased to see that in the FY21 request for the FAA, you provide full funding for the controllers and inspector workforce, with also targeted investments for safety initiatives. Again, very pleased to see that. The budget request also includes good news for the next-gen program, something that the chairman and I have been, frankly, spent a lot of time on. With almost $3 billion in the facilities and equipment account to both maintain our current infrastructure and obviously also to invest in new technologies. This is, Mr. Administrator, I will tell you, this is, you may not know this, but it's the first budget request in years that does not include a number of budget gimmicks. And so that has happened for years. I was almost taken back that you didn't do that, but I'm very grateful that your budget recommendation does not do that. So again, I congratulate you for this common sense approach, especially when our focus must be to maintain the global leadership in aviation and also supporting the talented workforce that so many of us, by the way, meet as we go back and forth through the various airports around the country. Administrator, I also want us to not lose sight of the important work that the FAA is doing to foster innovation in the airspace. While you work to establish new efficient routes based on satellite technology, you are also dealing with new entrants into the airspace. Again, technology is changing rapidly, and so that includes unmanned aircraft and commercial space vehicles, and that obviously is a challenge, but it's also a great opportunity. So these technologies present an almost, frankly, incomprehensible number of opportunities, and we want to make sure that that you have the tools to meet those challenges. And finally, as the chairman mentioned, my friend mentioned, the coronavirus is obviously something that is on everybody's mind. It is an all-of-government approach to dealing with this, and as it needs to be. And I know that you have some key responsibilities, helping to facilitate communication with the aviation industry, and also, as we were talking about briefly before the meeting, making sure that your folks are safe and available to do the very important job that they have to do. So just know that we're here to provide you all the support that you need, all the help that you need to fulfill this role, and we look forward to your update today and to continue working with you. And so, again, thank you for being here, and with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Administrator, we happy to have you proceed now. Your full testimony will be put into the record. We're inviting you to speak orally for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll have lots of questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you, and good morning, Chairman Price and Ranking Member Diaz-Balart and members of the subcommittee. Thank you again for the opportunity to discuss the administration's FY21 budget request for the FAA. And before I begin, I would like to say a few words about the 737 MAX. As you know, our international air transportation network is a tightly woven fabric that's vital to the world's economy. When that fabric rips, we feel the impact globally. We have to look no further than the tragic Lion Air and Ethiopian Airlines Boeing 737 MAX crashes to understand this. Onboard Ethiopian Airlines Flight ET302, which, as you noted, crashed 1 year ago yesterday, were the citizens of 35 countries. And on behalf of everyone at the FAA, I would like to once again extend our deepest sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims of both accidents. We will honor the memory of those who lost their lives by working tirelessly every day to ensure the highest possible margin of safety in the global aviation system. The administration's $17.5 billion request also honors those on board by funding a broad array of new safety enhancements while maintaining the day-to-day operations of the safest, most efficient, and complex airspace system in the world. The budget includes $15 million for the staffing and infrastructure enhancements we need to begin implementing the various recommendations we've received following the MAX crashes. That input, which we welcome, includes moving toward a more holistic versus transactional, item-by-item approach to certification, integrating human factors considerations more effectively throughout the design process, and finally, promoting an environment of just culture and safety management systems for all industries involved in the aerospace system. To support these themes, we're requesting $5 million to recruit additional specialized skills, such as more human factors experts and software engineers, and $5 million for a new system that tracks employee training, qualifications, and certifications to ensure our aviation safety workforce has the skills and knowledge required to execute our oversight functions. We're requesting $7 million to stand up a new office to oversee all Organization Designation Authorities, or ODA, in line with congressional direction. The budget includes almost $5 million in new funding to support improvements to several safety oversight systems, such as Aviation Safety Information Analysis and Sharing, or ASIAS, and the Aviation Safety Reporting Program. We're requesting an additional $13 million to safeguard against internal and external cyber threats, as well as to protect our new technologies against the threat of cyber attacks. Along with investments in aviation safety, the budget will fund efforts to integrate new entrants into the national airspace system. We'll also operationalize new technologies and systems to modernize how we manage traffic and make important investments in our nation's aviation infrastructure. We'll provide nearly $1 billion for next-gen investments, supporting the Next-Gen Advisory Committee's priorities, including initiatives for traffic flow and metering tools. These efforts will continue the operationalization of NextGen to unlock benefits for all the users of the national airspace system. We'll also invest in innovation with $144 million for work related to unmanned aircraft systems, or UAS, nearly one-third of which will be used to further develop an unmanned aircraft system traffic management solution, commonly called UTM. UTM is a critical enabler of the more advanced uses of UAS, such as package delivery and urban air mobility. For commercial space activities, our request of more than $44 million will speed the processing of licenses and approvals and streamline regulatory requirements. These funds will also help the FAA continue to advance the integration of space operations into the National Airspace System via automation tools such as the Space Data Integrator, or SDI. Our $3.35 billion request for Airport Improvement Program grants reflects the FAA's commitment to our nation's infrastructure and provides the funding needed to ensure safety, capacity, and efficiency at our nation's airports. It supports our continued focus on safety-related development projects, including projects to reduce runway incursions and to reduce the risk of wrong surface takeoffs and landings. In conclusion, this budget is a reflection on the importance of aviation to our nation's economy and the work the agency needs to continue to pursue in order to continue to enhance safety and stimulate innovation. Through the continued investments in this budget, the FAA will remain the world's aviation leader. And now, sir, I'm happy to take your and the committee's questions.
Thank you. I'll start, and we'll focus in on the coronavirus situation that you're confronting. Your regulatory and oversight responsibilities are take place at several levels. I want to concentrate on the possible transmission of contagious diseases on commercial flights. Health screenings prior to boarding aren't foolproof, as we all know. Once on board, both passengers and crew members are breathing in recirculated air, are in close proximity, and so forth. So could you tell us what the FAA requires with regards to the quality of the air circulating inside airplanes, and the cleanliness of the surfaces inside those airplanes, and in what you're doing to enhance both of those situations? What guidance are you giving? Is the CDC giving you with regard to transporting and tracing sick passengers? And can you also clarify the FAA's role with regards to the White House task force, the overall task force overseeing the effort?
Yes, sir. So several aspects that I'll undertake just in broad terms. As was mentioned earlier, we've got a whole of government approach working within the task force, and the Department of Transportation is part of the task force, and the FAA is supporting those efforts. The lead agencies are CDC and Homeland Security, but as the focal point for aviation, the FAA has played a key role in ensuring that CDC guidance and information is provided in a timely fashion, both to the traveling public, to flight crew members, and to all stakeholders in the aviation system, including our own employees in the FAA as well. Today alone, I believe we have 12 to 14 scheduled contacts and a number of offline conversations as the situation continues to evolve. In terms of your question on air quality, there are specific standards that regulate the quality of air on aircraft. Specifically, there has to be sufficient ventilation and lack of contaminants in the air in terms of noxious fumes and things like that. Also, the cabin air altitude cannot be above 8,000 feet, and air carriers are required to report any deficiencies in terms of air quality on aircraft, in terms of smoke and fume events. Working with the CDC and also the process by which aircraft are designed and has been studied over the years, the air quality within commercial aircraft is on par with what we see in public buildings and also within homes. And so the risk to the public is no higher than it would be in any area where you have folks gathered. So the same criteria really apply in terms of considerations that the CDC is providing. In addition to that, all the air carriers have reviewed their cleaning protocols, the substances they're using both on the flight deck and back in the passenger cabin. We have those requirements. The CDC has updated them within the last week, and we have provided that information to air carriers. And I have several examples I can share with the committee if you'd like on additional measures that the passenger carriers are taking to ensure sterile services on the aircraft.
I think there is a good deal of public, certainly apprehension, maybe misunderstanding about this air quality question. How is it that that degree of purity, freedom from contaminants, can be maintained? Is there any way of enhancing that? And is the generalization you just made, that does apply to pathogens, to airborne pathogens, that wants to conclude by virtue of what you just said that risk is no greater than it is in normal public places?
Yes, sir. The ventilation requirements, as aircraft are designed and certified, require that they meet certain standards in terms of adequate ventilation on the aircraft. Specifically, if you have an issue with fumes, pollen, those types of things, these things are required to be reported by the airlines. And if there's any indication that there's a problem with the system on the aircraft, they have to report that. But we do see that the research that's been done over the years is that there's really not any significant difference in what you would have in a building such as we're sitting in today in terms of air quality.
Thank you, Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator, I understand that the FAA is about to undertake an airspace metroplex redesign in South Florida with obviously potential airplane noise impacts and for individuals and communities close to Miami International Airport. As you know, Miami International Airport is almost in the middle of town, right? And there's not a lot of flexibility. So let me throw a couple questions at you. Let me throw them all at the same time, and you can answer them as you see fit. What is that schedule for the airspace redesign? What are the FAA's plans to engage the community as far as noise impacts of the redesign? And I know that there already been, I guess, some public hearings and meetings that already take place. Will there be a dedicated staff group or people to engage with the community? And I think a key one, too, is have you considered putting one person who is the go-to person as opposed to just having, people's complaints are always, who's in charge, who's accountable. I think that would be very helpful as well. So those are the issues I wanted you to kind of discuss with me.
Well, thank you for the question. As you noted, there is an ongoing project to redesign the airspace in Central and South Florida that's underway. There have been a number of workshops, I believe 20 workshops within the last year in terms of engaging congressional staff and local officials as well. There are another 17 that are planned for this year, and we have scheduled public meetings. We have another 20 scheduled. In terms of where the process itself stands, we're undergoing the draft initial environmental review of the project, which we expect to be completed sometime later this spring. And then there will be a comment period, and that will be finalized this fall. The actual flight procedures themselves will be implemented as we move forward into calendar year 2021, probably between the spring and the fall in several tranches of improvements. In terms of a single point of contact, we use our regional administrators as the point of contact. In addition to that, we have currently 8 noise community engagement officials. We're asking for 3 additional. and we deploy those around the system wherever the need is. Because as we have various projects that are implemented, they are subject matter experts, but they're not tied to a specific geographical area because we have projects going on in various parts of the country where we can use those resources.
Good. Let me, in the same vein, but the what is it called? The CLEAN program, whatever it actually stands for, Continuous Lower Energy Emissions and Noise Program. We've invested, subcommittee has invested about $125 million in that program since 2010, and again, to help industry develop more efficient and quieter engines, and because that would go a long way to solving the issue, right? So, if this succeeds, it would obviously, again, cut down on a lot of the concerns that most people have is noise related, and so what progress has been made by this program to reduce potential to make quieter engines, and what further progress do you expect within the next 5 or 10 years? Is this something that you think has promise?
Well, thanks for the question. It's a great point. The newer generation jet engines are quieter than we've ever, and more efficient, frankly, and more environmentally friendly than we've ever seen before. And the CLEAN program over the years has allowed us to bring industry together to pursue those design concepts. In FY21, we're asking for an additional $18 million to keep the project going. And you've also seen tremendous fleet renewal by the large U.S. carriers over the last 5 or 6 years as they've been financially able to replace older aircraft. So we've seen hundreds of narrow-body orders that also are our highest frequency and highest cadence users of domestic U.S. airspace. So that's been a benefit because it's also brought on more efficient airframes as well as more efficient and lower noise profile engines as well.
So again, they're quieter and more efficient and cleaner. May not have to eliminate aircraft travel after all, Mr. Chairman. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Lawrence?
Thank you. Mr. Dickerson, since arriving in Congress, it's been a passion of mine to fight for women's rights and increasing women opportunities in what some would consider untraditional fields of study. That includes numerous positions within the aviation industry. As you know, throughout history, women have been grossly underrepresented in the aviation industry, accounting for only 6% of pilots and 4% of flight engineers. As co-chair of both the Women's Caucus and the Skilled American Workforce Caucus, it's my responsibility to ensure that every little girl that aspires to be the next Amelia Earhart or the Betsy Coleman has the proper resources to do so. And as the administrator of FAA, I will argue you have that same responsibility as I do. In 2010, the FAA established the Educational Partnership Initiative, a program meant to focus on the relationships between institutions representing underserved groups and diverse populations, such as aerospace studies, science, engineering, air traffic control. In particular, this is the exact type of program that the government should be prioritizing, but unfortunately, I'm uncertain whether that's happening. So could you please provide me today with the status of the Educational Partnership Initiative and how the department looks to build upon the program?
Well, thank you for the question, and I am in the strongest agreement I can possibly can be that we need to eliminate barriers to women and underserved portions of our population to show them what great opportunities there are in aviation, because it's a tremendous career, and I think that a lot of times young people don't see it as something that they can do. I will have to get back to you on the specifics of the program that you mentioned, but we do have a number of initiatives working with the Department of Transportation, other federal agencies, academia, the private sector, to promote aviation careers and eliminate barriers to those who want to take advantage of those opportunities.
So, Mr. Dixon, please provide, and if you don't have, I think there should be a dedicated study on how you can include and embrace and do programs to introduce more women into your workforce. In my district, over the past few years, thousands of families have been exposed and impacted by PFAS contaminants. The toxic substance is included in firefighting foam, which commercial airports are mandated to use throughout their operations. Under the 2018 FAA reauthorization bill, however, this mandate changed. The 2018 bill provided that commercial manufacturers are no longer required, aircraft manufacturers are no longer required to use PFAS chemicals in their fighting foam. Can you, as you know, PFAS is extremely dangerous. Can you please discuss when the FAA expects to issue the final regulations provision that exempts commercial airports from using the toxic PFAS in firefighting?
Well, thank you for the question. There's a lot of work going on in this particular area. In fact, we opened up at our tech center in New Jersey. In January, we opened up a new $5 million facility that's designed to do this testing, and we're doing baseline testing of the existing products out there now. And we're working very closely to do this work with the Department of Defense, which does the initial certification and very similar product that we use for civil aviation and airports. So we are in the process of determining what alternatives are available out there. That will take some time. In the short term, what we have done is we have made available, and we have the airport improvement grants for airports to be able to purchase with that grant money equipment that when they're required to test their firefighting equipment, it doesn't actually discharge anything onto the ramp or onto the airport property. So that will mitigate many of the short-term effects of what we see because they'll be able to keep all of that contained within the unit, and that's a brand new capability.
So my last question, I'm glad you're working on, do you have a timeline when we can expect that you will be in compliance with eliminating PFAS from the firefighting?
It will take a while to do the research. At this point, there has not been a substitute out there that has the effectiveness in putting out an aircraft fire that we have seen. So it will take some time to conduct the research, but we'll get back to you with a specific timeline. We are moving forward, though, very aggressively on this point.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Womack.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Administrator Dixon, for your testimony here today and your service to the country. I don't know if Ms. Lawrence was referring to the section in the Reauthorization Act of 18, Section 625, on the $10 million that was authorized for primarily pilots and maintainers. This is an education process, but what are you doing to implement, because it's been fully funded, what are you doing to implement that?
Yes, sir. Well, the specific, the two grant programs, $5 million each, as you noted, 5 for pilots and 5 for maintenance technicians. We're in the process of working through, I believe, those funds became available in December, and we are working through the process right now. We expect to have the grant applications out there within the next few months, and that will all take place this year to get those programs up and running.
When Secretary Chow was here a couple of weeks ago, I asked her about contract towers. I'm going to ask you basically the same question. Of course, I've got a parochial interest because I've got several contract towers in the state of Arkansas. Certainly 4 of them are in my district. Can you comment briefly as to where you see this contract tower program going, which I consider to be a pretty good partnership that the FAA has that helps to ensure safety?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for the question. Contract towers are an extremely important part of our aviation infrastructure, particularly when it comes to airports in smaller communities, making sure that we've got the appropriate margin of safety there. And I believe we have currently approximately 250 contract towers, and we're requesting funding for those operations of $172 million. We do have a benefit cost analysis process that we have to go through to ensure that we're putting towers in the locations where there will be enough traffic so that there is a safety benefit. But I see us continuing to support the contract tower program.
I don't want to get too down in the weeds on the benefit cost analysis, but when that happens, is that a snapshot of a like a certain period of time in a given day that may or may not reflect the ongoing need?
My understanding is the benefit cost analysis uses a 2018 baseline, and there is a 1/10 of a point increase that was put into the authorizing legislation that allows us to essentially, if it's a close call, to put a particular airport over the bar.
I see. I got in my remaining time, I got a couple of questions about the MAX program, and you may have covered this in your opening, and I got here a little bit late. As you look to our current aircraft certification system, do you see any changes on the horizon that would make to ensure a more sound safety regulatory system?
Well, the short answer is yes. Essentially, we have a number of recommendations from various reviews that have been done, all of which have a slightly different perspective, and those are all very helpful. It really comes down to addressing three particular issues, and that is making the oversight process more holistic and more focused on the safety of the system as it's designed, rather than complying with individual rules, which is, you would hope that those rules would looked at together, would provide the level of safety, and they have over the years that we want. But I think we're in a world now where we really need to look at the interdependencies in a more sophisticated way than we've had to in the past. We also need to introduce human factors considerations into design. It has been a part of the design criteria before, but that needs to be more integrated. And we also need to develop safety management systems, which will actually allow us to oversee the manufacturing process much more effectively, because it requires data and communication that doesn't necessarily exist with the level of detail that it needs to now.
Yeah, I'm about to run out of time, so I'm going to let you take these for the record, and that is on this MAX, the reports that I've read that suggest that there may be a rewiring of the entire 737 MAX requirement. I'd like to know a little bit more about that and what's driving the potential need to do that. But again, I won't require you to go through that here today because I'm out of time, and take that for the record. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Torres.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Dixon, for being here. For the past 20 years, the FAA air traffic controllers and technicians have relied upon the integrated control and monitoring systems to monitor and control all critical electronic systems operating the 16 major airports in the U.S. Yet, despite pleas from members of Congress on both sides of the aisle and from air traffic controllers to refresh the software of these systems, which is long overdue, the FAA has refused to act. I'd like to point out that this committee, in the fiscal year 20 THUD funding bill, included language highlighting this very issue, as it would impact air traffic operations and the traveling public. It is my understanding that the FAA has still not acted to refresh the systems. Could you please explain why this is the case, and if, what you planned, what the status report is?
Thank you for the question. The systems that you're referring to actually don't monitor all of the critical systems. They monitor specifically the navigational aids around the airport.
Which is critical.
Absolutely. And so we continually, along with all of our technology, we will continually evaluate what the risk is of doing or not doing a tech refresh. And this is an area that we're currently evaluating, and we will address moving forward.
Technology is ancient technology, and it continues to age, and the refreshment part of it is soon not going to be a reliable source for pilots to utilize or air traffic controllers to utilize. So, I hope that you would see the urgency to this. It's also my understanding that FAA is in the process of evaluating the implementation of the National Aerospace Systems, NAS, program designed to enhance NAVID and VisAid control and monitoring capabilities in air traffic control towers. And the FAA is considering either expanding the use of the integrated control and monitoring systems, a system designed and manufactured by a minority-owned small business group from Southern California, or upgrading and expanding the universal interlock control, a system that is designed and manufactured by the FAA in competition with a minority-owned firm in Southern California. Can you clarify for me whether or not the FAA has been in competition with any private company regarding the UIC, NAVAIDS, or VisAIDS monitoring efforts?
Well, thank you for the question, ma'am. The UIC capability that you spoke about, my understanding is that was undertaken in 2009 at some airports that did not have the system that you're talking about, and it's even more narrowly focused. We will review our acquisition protocols to make sure that we comport with the acquisition guidelines in terms of the competition issues that you raised.
So as you respond to me, I hope that you would justify why this is taking place, given that OMB guidelines are prohibiting that you are in direct competition with small minority businesses. Secondary, Administrator, as you know, Congress included in the last FAA bill a strong, clear, and legally binding mandate that the FAA require all new aircraft to have secondary barriers starting in October of 2019. This is a safety and security mandate that dates back to 9/11, and that Congress could not be any more clear, clear and direct about this. You are now past due and have full legal authority to implement this requirement today, just as you did last October, when you were supposed to issue this order, but instead you created a working group to study the issue, further delaying this much-needed safety enhancement. When do you intend to comply with the law?
Well, ma'am, we are moving forward on this issue. It is a very high priority for me. We are moving forward on this issue
How often does a study group meet?
as quickly as we can. They meet, they converse on a regular basis. They met.
When is that? Quarterly, monthly, weekly, daily?
In person, I would have to get you the schedule. I know that we are expecting a report from them later this month, and that will give us the technical details that we need to provide the manufacturer's guidelines that we can actually enforce. And
My
that's
time
what
has expired,
has been
sir, but
missing.
I hope that I am being very, very clear to you that these are critical safety measures for the flying public, and that we expect you to follow the law. I yield back.
Ms. Clark?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for joining us today. First, I want to also thank you for your support of the Aviation Sustainability Center known as ASCENT. It has brought researchers at Boston University, MIT, and others together to quantify the impacts of air quality in affected communities. We look forward to our ongoing partnership. I want to ask you also about, in the fiscal year 18 THUD report, this committee directed the FAA to report back on sound installation installed prior to 2007. and examine the effective lifespan of mitigation treatments and make recommendations. This report was released last year, and in addition, Massport, the Massachusetts Port Authority, sent a letter to you at the end of January regarding the retreatment of homes that were sound insulated during the early years of the soundproofing program. FAA's current policy does not allow for retreatment of homes. What is your plan for replacing the equipment that has lost its effectiveness? I know the FAA has acknowledged that current window and door treatments are far more effective and durable. And are you open to revisiting this policy so homeowners can take advantage of those efficiencies?
Well, thank you for the question, and the short answer is yes. The standards for insulation were actually established in 1993, although there had been work that type of reimbursement occurred prior to that. At this point, our research has not indicated that there's any deterioration in those measures. But because of the fact that there were no standards established prior to 1993, we are looking very seriously at allowing AIP funds to be used. Now, the airport that's requesting the funds would have to essentially prioritize that with other safety and efficiency projects that they have, along with noise issues in the adjacent local communities. But it is something that we are looking at very closely, and we'll certainly be happy to work with you on that.
So when you say you're looking at it very closely, does that mean you are changing the policy, or you're still examining?
We are in active discussions to change the policy. But to my knowledge, as of sitting here today, I can't tell you that it has changed, but we are in active discussions to do that.
Do you have any sort of timeline on a final decision?
I would have to get back to you on the specifics, but it would be in the very short term.
Okay, we will look forward to a very short-term answer, because I think there are homeowners, not only in my district, but across the country, that really need to be able to update the soundproofing that has been offered.
I understand.
I'd also like to talk about, in light of the Boeing 737 crashes, some time on your human capital needs to ensure that there's an adequate level of oversight in both aircraft certification and flight standards, particularly for companies like Boeing that have organization designation authorization, which basically means they are allowed to self-inspect and regulate. Is that right? Is that a fair characterization?
I would not use the term self-inspection or regulation. The FAA is required to oversee those processes, and an ODA it's a privilege. They have a very high level of responsibility in terms of producing safe products. And that delegation process has produced safe products for many decades, but as with any process, as we've said, it can certainly be improved. And I think the FAA's ability to oversee the process currently has areas that need to be improved, and that is what you're seeing in our budget request.
And is that a part of the additional staffing, is to help you in this area?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And could you continue to update us on the status of hiring the new technical employees and the type of capacities that these employees are going to fulfill?
Of course. In the current year, we are in the process of recruiting and hiring additional human factors experts, and also software engineers, systems engineers, those who have the capability, technicians or specialists to perform integrated system safety assessments. All of those are areas that will improve the level of sophistication of the FAA's oversight. In addition, in the FY21 budget request, we are asking to add an additional 50 on top of the 34 that we'll bring on this year. and then an additional 13 for our ODA office that was stood up in the 2018 reauthorization.
Thank you.
Mr. Hurd.
Thank you, Chairman. Administrator, it's good to have you here. You've had an interesting year. I know we talked a little bit about COVID-19 already. Can you take 30 seconds and just describe FAA's role in dealing with COVID-19 and maybe larger scale? It is larger scale crises like this.
Yes, Congressman, thanks for the question. The FAA has been involved from the very beginning. Of course, we're part of the Department of Transportation, which is actually on the President's task force, and we have been supporting, acting as really an honest broker between the federal government and all elements of the aviation industry, whether it's airlines or airports or crew members and passengers. And so we've been making sure that when we've been in a containment posture up to this point, that we are helping to put processes in place for passenger screening and contact tracing when that's warranted, and essentially supporting the CDC's efforts. Within the FAA itself, we've, for the last 8 weeks or so, we've essentially had 3 lines of effort. The first line of effort is our internal coordination. It's a process that we use for hurricanes and other contingencies that happen. That group has been stood up and operating continuously since about the middle of January. We have also been working as part of the interagency process, which I just discussed. And then about 3 to 4 weeks ago, we began to pivot to attention to our own operations plans in terms of mission assurance, because we need to be able to continue to take care of our own people and manage the air traffic control operations, as well as enable our aviation safety inspectors and technicians to be able to make sure the system continues to run.
Right now, today, how do you characterize traveling by air?
I would say that, as I mentioned in response to the chairman's question earlier, that the considerations that the CDC has put out in terms of those who are at risk or and should look at large gatherings or traveling on long flights. But other than that, there aren't any significant restrictions or considerations beyond what we would have in any workplace or public gathering.
Gotcha. I represent San Antonio. I'm one of the 5 that represent San Antonio. Lackland Air Force Base is there. HHS is involved in taking folks from the excuse me, the Grand Princess cruise ship to Lackland Air Force Base. Would you agree that in the interest of public safety, those chartered flights that HHS is doing, having them land directly on a military facility like Lackland would be the preferred route or the preferred practice?
I believe that's pretty much been the practice. The repatriation flights and these repositioning flights are actually either state aircraft or public aircraft operations under the State Department, and they have to comport with, since they're flying in the civil aviation system, they have to comport with the FAA's regulations. But in terms of passenger facilitation and management, that's really is the responsibility of HHS, CDC, and CBP. And my observations up to this point is they are managing that process appropriately to make sure that there's no elevated risk of any transmissions.
Good copy. Switching to a new topic, unmanned aerial systems. The budget has $144 million in it for this program, and $2 million for working with law enforcement partners on counter UAS and protection at these airports. Is that enough?
I would say it is a continuing developing challenge for our aviation system, but I believe that our request for this coming fiscal year is enough to do the research that we need to do to continue to improve our capabilities in these areas. The FAA's primary emphasis here in working with our law enforcement partners and airports primarily is to ensure that that we deal with unauthorized, clueless, and careless, and then also anyone who wants to do harm, that we actually have the rulemaking and the detection processes in place to be able to address those issues. That's where our focus is.
In my final 30 seconds, your opening remarks, you talked about how the the low altitude authorization and notification capability was a success story in automation in partnership with industry and government. Why?
It's a great question. I think what it has done is that it has provided the foundation for which we will be able to build an unmanned traffic management system with the private sector to be able to deconflict UAS from each other as we continue to integrate them in our system. One of the our strategy really is to integrate UAS in the coming years rather than segregate them to specific geographic areas or routes. And Lance is really the first capability where we're seeing the ability to be able to begin to manage what that process could look like in the coming years.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, sir, for being here. In 2015, OMB greenlighted a study, the DNL, on my urging, to re-examine day-night level metric used to measure aircraft noise pollution. May of 2018, FAA said it's really close, and since that time, it's been delayed 22 months. We have heard from multiple sources that it was delayed because of methodology issues. Is that true? Is the study close? Were there issues with how it was conducted?
So thanks for the question. DNL currently, as you know, is the only metric that we have that takes into account all of the criteria in terms of measuring the impact of noise on our communities. And we continue to do research on what other methodologies would capture time and place and duration as well. And so far, there hasn't been anything that has replicated that. If you're referring to the noise annoyance study, which is that is due out in October, and we expect to meet that deadline.
Were you aware of any problems with the methodology in the study?
I'm not personally aware.
Could you find out and let this committee know?
Absolutely.
Ask them. I have problems with the word annoyance because, as you know, these public health studies are talking about far more than annoyance. They're talking about real public health risk. And I certainly appreciate that. And I hope we're talking about the same study. Second, this past summer, the FAA worked with local authorities in New York to adjust flight patterns and procedures to help limit noise around JFK. But in a letter to the Congressional Quiet Skies Caucus, Administrator Dixon, you stated that FAA's review process for these changes has been, quote, irregular, and had serious flaws in it, including not consulting with the JFK Tower. Obviously, those are big red flags, and it's good that they were caught, but why is it that internal communication at the FAA let this happen, that the agency can agree to significant changes in flight operations and then go back on it, really on what it said it was going to do, when it realizes its own internal procedures were violated?
Well, it's a great question. Thanks for the opportunity to respond. It's really important that when we look at noise issues, that we realize that it's an entire community issue, and we want to make sure that the entire community is engaged and that we're not just moving noise arbitrarily between one community and an adjacent community, for example. This inquiry was made to the approach control, which did not consult with the tower. This is why it's really important, as I mentioned to Congressman Diaz-Balart, that we work through the regional administrator to make sure that we can bring these issues forward and have them addressed on a holistic basis rather than just to solve one issue. I will say that the altitude request for operating above 3,000 feet on the arrivals, that actually was executed and was part of my response to the inquiry from the caucus.
Sir, is it safe to say that the problems that took place here won't be replicated, then working in and around O'Hare and other airports, we're not going to have these same issues?
We will not, as long as we are able to understand that the appropriate place for us to engage with you and your staffs is through the regional administrator, then we'll be able to make sure that process is appropriately managed.
Sure, my friend and colleague, Mr. Swazi, is interested as his constituents are as to this correction's been made as to how it was moved forward. Now, how long will might they have to wait to find out what, if any, other corrective measures can be taken to adjust to the noise?
Well, as I said, the altitude portion has already been addressed. The runway usage, again, that's something that we would have to work through the New York Roundtable to make sure that we're not
Is that process
changing.
going on? We can report back to the congressman that it's being worked on soon?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Administrator, I want to return to the safety lessons from the 737 MAX disasters, matters raised by Mr. Womack and Ms. Clark and others. I want to drill down a bit on two aspects of this, and I'll ask both questions at once. First has to do with the manufacturer's role in the ODA process. There's some, of course, widespread misgivings about that process, but having said that, the FAA does not have the capacity to inspect every aspect of every plane in U.S. aviation. So if ODA is necessary at some level, how can you improve it? That's the big question. How can the FAA ensure that the ODA employees are acting in the best interest of the FAA and not their employer? What can the FAA do to protect ODA employees from undue pressures? And then, perhaps most importantly, what can you do to ensure that the same culture of safety that you aspire to at the FAA permeates this process? I know that's difficult, but that's important. Secondly, having to do with human factors. The investigations into the FAA certification process have identified that the FAA made some incorrect assumptions about pilot responses and that the agency needs to integrate human factor analysis into the certification process more effectively. Of course, you have a myriad of circulars, orders, notices related to human factors that date back to the 1990s. So what are we to conclude? That you haven't been successful in following your own guidance, or that the guidance is unenforceable, or that the guidance needs to be revised? I mean, can you update us on this? And then, and this particularly came out in the oversight hearing we held in this subcommittee some months ago. What about the variation of experiences of foreign pilots and mechanics, the international aspect of this? Are you modifying, or do you need to modify that guidance when you consider the variance of international experiences?
Well, thank you. I'll try to address those in sequence. With respect to, I think the first issue, I would just put it under the broad topic of how do we manage and make sure that there's not undue pressure or a conflict of interest in the among the ODA members. And with any manufacturing process, any private company, even an airline, there are always going to be mission pressures. You know, a captain wanting to get the airplane to its destination on time. In this case, getting a design project completed. There are going to be schedule pressures that the process, safety process, needs to be able to stay intact and be of primacy, but also the leadership, both at the FAA and at the manufacturer, need to make sure that they continuously message and are listening for indications that that may not be the case. And for example, You know, when I was leading my pilots at the airline, I always told them, you know, sometimes you're your own worst enemy. You know, you really want to get your customers to their destination, but don't ever hesitate, if you've got any concern at all, to pull off to the side of the taxiway. Let's set the parking brake and get everything sorted out. That's always going to trump being on time and being efficient if you need to. The same is true in the manufacturing sector. And there are some structural things that some companies have done that I think are best practices in terms of separating the safety chain from the manufacturing chain to make sure that quality and safety is emphasized throughout the process. We also need to recognize there's a lot of flexibility in the ODA system where it really is a privilege for a company to have ODA as a program. And I think it is a more effective way for the FAA to manage a manufacturing process rather than trying to manage individual designees. But the process has to be robust and it has to have safety as its primary consideration. And I think some of the resources that we're asking for in terms of system safety analysis and effective oversight tools, I have a big emphasis at the agency on data, and the ability to be able to look at the data as the project is proceeding is, for the FAA is going to be extremely important in this process.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to defer the answer on the human factors. I do want to hear that. Defer that, though, until the next round since my time's expired. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In the same vein, Administrator, I would like to first thank you for putting the safety first. As to the review of the MAX, we know that you won't certify this aircraft until you are certain that it is safe. I guess I read or heard that you personally are going to fly the airplane before it's certified. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So all indications that I hear are that you are making good progress on that review, and that obviously we look forward to the day that airplane can safely return to our airspace. Would you give us a sense of how thorough your review has been and what steps still remain before the plane can be recertified?
I would say that this is the most thorough review that any airplane has ever had throughout the history of aviation. I mean, we are leaving no stone unturned, and we have essentially reallocated resources within the agency to make sure that we have the resources to continue to make sure that every step of the process is followed. The next major milestone is the certification flight, and there were a number of several software changes that were recently made to address some issues that had come up, and it remains to be seen whether we have to reaccomplish the audit associated with those changes. But after that work is completed, then we will that will lead us to the certification flight. It's impossible to say exactly when that will occur, but when it does, we will then take some time, a matter of a few days, I think, to review the data from the certification flight, and then that will enable us to bring in the 16 airline pilots, both U.S. and international pilots of various experience levels, to complete the training that Boeing has recommended, which includes simulator modules as well. My deputy administrator is going to complete that training alongside that process. And then once this process is completed, I will complete the training and then conduct a certification flight. In parallel with those training requirements, there are some technical steps that have to be taken to make sure the airplanes have all the upgrades and maintenance work completed on them. And then there will be an airworthiness directive and the ungrounding order after that. Subsequent to the ungrounding, then we will also, the certificate management offices in the U.S. will then work with their individual airlines that they oversee to approve their specific training programs for their operations.
Right. There have been several studies and investigations of the certification of the MAX, of the process, both from inside and outside of the FAA. Can you just talk about some of the findings in those reviews, particularly those findings that may be critical to the FAA's role?
It's a great question. So there have been, we've had the Joint Authorities Technical Review, we've had the Technical Advisory Board, which we're specifically paying attention to with respect to the MAX itself, the Secretary's Special Committee on Aircraft Certification, the National Transportation Safety Board recommendations. We have the accident investigations from the 2 accidents, and we also have congressional investigations as well. So all of those have resulted and will result in a number of recommendations, but they're generally falling along the themes that I mentioned earlier, the 3 themes that I mentioned in my opening statement. Having said that, we don't want to lose the granularity of the individual recommendations, so we are mapping them together. They tend to, in many cases, get at the same issues, utilizing slightly different wording or maybe a little different emphasis. And remember, we're talking about a process that isn't specific to Boeing. We're talking about 79 ODAs around the country that we need to have a process that we'll be able to support. And so the funding that we're asking for in terms of the improvements to aviation safety and safety systems will enable us to move along the path toward implementing those recommendations.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I switched up on you. Thank you so much. Just briefly, when I was a law student, I got to take part in a case against Morton Thiokol, looking at how the O-rings had been developed in the shuttle disaster, a preventable disaster. And it really was pressure to meet contract, to raise the bottom line that did it. With the coronavirus, the airline industry, airline manufacturers are going to be under increasing stress. And I just want to implore you, as the FAA, I know that you are committed to this, but you are what stands between protecting passengers, their families, the networks that love them and support them, and a race for a bottom line that can cause disaster in the air. So we appreciate what you're doing and just feel that that role of protecting safety is always foremost for the FAA, but it is going to be challenged in new ways. I want to go back to specifically a question that the chairman asked about the investigations into the certification process, where the FAA made incorrect assumptions about pilot responses and needing to integrate the human factor analysis into the aircraft certification process. The FAA has a myriad of circulars, orders, and notices relating to human factors analysis dating back to the 1990s. Is the FAA not following its own guidance, or is the guidance unenforceable?
Well, thank you for the question. First of all, with respect to your first point, that's absolutely our focus, to make sure that we have the highest margin of safety in the system, and we have processes in place for increased surveillance on areas that we think might be under stress if that proves to be necessary financially. With respect to, we have a number of advisory circulars and guidance material that some of it dates to the 90s, but there have been more recent with respect to flight deck architecture considerations that have been developed and we use. Some of the assumptions are about human performance are not only what we use in the U.S., but they're what other authorities, other states of design have used, and they're essentially globally accepted criteria. And I think one of the benefits that we have, and I think it's been a strength of the United States going through this process, is our openness and transparency and our willingness to accept critique throughout this process. It will make the process stronger. And I would expect that working with the other states of design, primarily the Europeans, the Canadians, and the Brazilians. Our coordination and our cooperation is really stronger than ever, and we will be looking at all of these elements in terms of human factors and things like the change product rule and what those improvements will look like going forward.
Do you anticipate you'll be modifying your guidance to consider the variance of experience of foreign pilots?
Well, I think you can see that we are already taking actions. We're not waiting to rewrite guidance. The fact that we are including, I mentioned the joint operations review that's going to evaluate the training proposal from Boeing. This is the first time that any authority has used airline pilots from various international countries. We've used pilots from other aviation authorities, but never pilots from various experience levels to complete a process to validate a training proposal.
Great, thank you. On that note, with the sort of global aviation using foreign pilots, do you think the ICAO is still an effective body for globalizing aviation standards?
Well, there's no organization in the world that's done more to promote aviation safety than the FAA. And one of the ways we do that, but not the only way, is through ICAO. The ICAO process can take some time, as you noted, but we have to be there because that's how we can exercise influence globally. The FAA we devote a number of people and quite a bit of attention to what's going on at ICAO. But in addition to that, we work bilaterally with many authorities. We also work regionally in areas where it makes sense. Most recently, I was out at the Singapore Air Show, for example, and worked with 5 of the aviation authorities in South Asia on exactly the issues that you're talking about with respect to pilot training and qualification. So we will continue to take a multifaceted approach.
Thank you. Mr. Diaz-Balart.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Actually, on that note, how do I say this kindly? I want to be diplomatic about this. But look, other international certifying agencies may have, potentially, and I'm thinking about China, for example, may not be as transparent as the FAA as to what how do you make sure that political reasons, because they might have ties with manufacturers or whatever, don't come between the certification of the MAX, not for safety reasons, but because of other reasons. And so I'm trying to be diplomatic, but I think you know what I'm saying here.
Sure. Well, obviously, again, these airplanes will be operated around the world, as are many U.S. produced products. And so that's why it's very important that I think the FAA takes a leadership role as the most influential and really many would say the gold standard for aviation safety in the world. That may look a little different now than it might have 20 or 25 years ago because there are other competent authorities out there that we can work with and that have very sophisticated capabilities themselves. So that's in answer to Congresswoman Clark's question. It really is a situation where, yes, we work through ICAO, but we also work in a different way depending on what the aviation authorities are, whether it's China or EASA or Singapore, whoever it is. That engagement and that level of assistance and mentoring may look a little bit different.
Let me change subjects entirely. In December, I joined my 2 Florida senators raising concern at Miami International Airport. I don't know if you're aware of this, regarding the potential purchase of the passenger boarding bridges from a Chinese state-backed enterprise. Now, this subcommittee started through, I think it was actually Congresswoman Granger who started showing concern about, for example, Chinese involvement in rolling stock, Chinese state enterprise and rolling stock. And in the NDAA, that was actually, there was a halt put to that in a bipartisan way on rolling stock. So I've been concerned with the anti-competitive nature of bids from these state-controlled, state-run, or tied with state enterprises in China, dealing with, again, I don't know what you call these things, I guess the boarding bridges, passenger boarding bridges. And so the concern is not only the anti-competitive nature, but the fact that it could potentially pose a security threat, because these companies then could be used to potentially exploit our aviation and national security network. So again, it's also a national security issue. I just want to make sure that you're familiar with that, and a lot of those funds are not federal funds. I get that, but Mr. Administrator, I just wanted to kind of put it on your front burner to make sure that the FAA does whatever it can, so that federal funds are not used to support these Chinese-backed companies, which is, again, I think, anti-competitive, but also a national security issue. So I'm not asking for an answer, but I just want to make sure that you're aware of that, and that I can't speak for anybody else, but there was very strong bipartisan concern about rolling stock. I think this is even more dangerous. So I just want to put it on your radar.
Understand, and there are Buy American requirements for federal for AIP funds, which would certainly be looked at if federal money was used for these systems, and also with respect to the security, cybersecurity in particular, that is something that we're focused on. We work very closely with Homeland Security and DoD as part of the Aviation Cyber Initiative. We're also requesting an additional $13 million to make our own systems more robust, and also ensure that the aviation system is appropriately protected.
And I appreciate that. I just want to make sure, Administrator, that the passenger boarding bridges doesn't, bad pun, go, fly under the radar. But with that, that's all I have. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you. Have to remember to hit that button. But we do truly thank you for your time today. And the committee staff will be in contact with your staff regarding any questions for the record. If you would please return the information for the record to the committee within 30 days from next Wednesday, we'll be able to publish the transcript of today's hearings. With that, Mr. Diaz-Balart, any final comments? With that, the hearing is adjourned.